Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at Daniel's 77s in our continuing study of end times prophecy. We jump right into the middle of Daniel chapter 9. Daniel has been praying in this chapter. Actually, he'd been reading Jeremiah's prophecy, given a few generations earlier. Jeremiah had said there would be a 70-year captivity, and Daniel's looking at his calendar and thinking, are we there yet? And in his prayer, an angel shows up and gives him this explanation. And here we begin, verse 24. 70 weeks have been decreed for your people and your holy city to finish the transgression, to make an end of sin, to make atonement for iniquity, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal up vision and prophecy, and to anoint the most holy place. Now, notice that list of things. 77s, or we could say 70 weeks, because a week is just a collection of seven, as it turns out, 7 days, to finish the transgression, to make an end of sin, to make atonement for iniquity. Is this list beginning to sound a little familiar, especially for Christians? I think it should. To bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal up vision and prophecy, to anoint the most holy place. It's striking that there's six things, six, can I say them, six labors, 6 days of work. It reminds me of something way back in Genesis chapter 1. And then the seventh day God rests. But notice these works sound a lot like what Jesus did upon the cross. The prophecy continues, verse 25. So you are to know and discern that from the issuing of a decree to restore and rebuild Jerusalem. So that's the part when that's the time when this all begins. Until Messiah the Prince, there will be, and notice, so from one to the other, there will be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. Now, it doesn't specifically say they are in order like that, one right after the other. Could they run concurrently? We'll look at a few different views on this. But notice in Jerusalem, it will be built again with plaza and moat, even in times of distress. The passage continues, verse 26. Then after the 62 weeks, the Messiah will be cut off and have nothing. Again, that sounds very familiar to us Christians. And the people of the prince who is to come. This seems like a different individual, not Messiah, but this other one. The prince who is to come will destroy the city. So we talked about the city being built, and then the people of the prince who is to come will destroy the city and the sanctuary, both the temple and the city of Jerusalem. And its end will come with a flood. Even to the end, there will be war. Desolations are determined. Notice that term, desolations. Now, the day for these weeks, these 62 weeks and 7 weeks, when we read this, I think it might help us to remember a prophecy that had been given in Ezekiel chapter 4, and it was a prophecy regarding Jerusalem and its eventual destruction. And of course, it was destroyed back in Ezekiel's day. And as Ezekiel actually plays the part, he builds a little model of Jerusalem, and he lies on his left side and then on his right side. And then God explains, for so many days he's doing this, God explains, I have assigned you a number of days corresponding to the years of their iniquity. And then he explains that it's a day for each year. I think what might be happening here, and a lot of people agree, in fact, most people agree, that that what we have here in these 62 weeks and in these 7 weeks and 62 weeks are a day for a year, and it's telling us when Messiah is going to come. Now, which Messiah? Because remember, the term Messiah just means the anointed one. And a lot of people in history have been anointed. Priests were anointed, kings were anointed. There's even a time where prophets anointed. Are we talking about the ultimate Messiah, Jesus, or are we talking about some other anointed one? And again, not everyone agrees. So we're going to look at the different views. Now, some of the dates that have been given for the beginning of this period, specifically for the beginning of when the decree went out to restore and rebuild not just the temple, but to rebuild Jerusalem. You have Cyrus who made a decree. He didn't really mention the temple. He was talking about rebuilding Jerusalem. So 539 BC, he makes his decree, roughly, give or take a year. You add and you do the math to add up all those years, And so add 483 years, and that brings you to 56 BC. Nothing happened in 56 BC. That's sort of a null date. Next, you go down to the next one that made a decree. That was Darius the Great. Ezra chapter 6, verses 8 through 12 talk about a decree that he made in 520 BC. This was after they had come back to Jerusalem and they had started rebuilding the temple, but then they got interrupted, and then he said, "No, you can finish it." So it really wasn't a decree about the city of Jerusalem, just about the temple. And then there's another decree after this. Artaxerxes, the one who follows Darius, he makes another decree in 457 BC that results in Ezra coming back to the city and work beginning. And finally, Artaxerxes makes a second decree for him. That's the fourth that we've seen here, 445 BC. And that's with Nehemiah in order to rebuild the walls of the city. Not necessarily the city, but the walls. Okay, so if we do the math on Darius, notice we got 37 BC. That was the date that Herod the Great sort of got back in power. He'd been kicked out by the Jews, went to Rome, got the kingdom handed back to him by Rome, and came back to Israel. And finally, the dust settled in 37 BC. But other than that, not really a lot about Jerusalem, so it doesn't really work for us. However, when we come to the first decree of Artaxerxes, we do the math. 27 AD is around the time when the ministry of Jesus begins, when Jesus as the Messiah shows up. So that could work. That could work for us. And then the last date, notice 445 BC, we do the math, 39 AD, nothing happens there. So that doesn't really help us if we're using just like regular years. Now, there are some who are going to say, well, we're going to take those years and compress them and make them special years, and then it might work. But notice one of these decrees, I didn't have to do anything to the years. I didn't have to like slip a card in there or anything like that. It worked nicely by itself. All right. Three different views we're going to look at. First of all, the Maccabean interpretation, and this is an interpretation usually held by Jewish people, and that doesn't make it wrong. Let me just say, we ought to notice it. And it notices from the first fall of Jerusalem down to, and this is just taking the 62 weeks, not the 7 weeks, which it does not take as happening one right after the other. Notice they're in parallel instead. From 605 BC to 171 BC, and in 171 BC, what happened is the events leading up to the Maccabean revolt, where Antiochus IV, we talked about him in a previous class, he murdered the high priest, or at least he had him murdered, so that he could pay off he was going to actually extort some funds from the temple, and the high priest wouldn't have anything to do with it. And another fellow said, look, if you get rid of the high priest and make me high priest, I'll pay the bribes off, and you'll get your money. So that's what took place. But then notice, in order to make this work, then you take those 7 weeks and you say, well, that's not in that line. That's a separate timeline where you look at 586 BC, the temple is destroyed, and around 537, it's close enough for government work, might be off by a year or so, where Cyrus gives the order for the temple to be rebuilt. So that can work. And notice, we haven't gotten there, but when we finish the prophecy, we'll see that in the middle of the 70th week, something's going to happen. And sure enough, in the middle of the 70th week, in other words, if I go 7 more years and look in the middle of that, that's when Antiochus actually came into the temple, put up an idol of himself, desecrated the temple, set up what we could really call the abomination of desolation. So in a sense, this all happened back in the days of the Maccabees. So that actually works. Maybe not as smoothly as you might like, but it does work. Next interpretation. Next interpretation we're going to look at is the dispensational interpretation. Now, this usually, it doesn't have to, I suppose, but the one that's quite popular looks at 444 BC, the last decree. I guess we could have gone with the one that fit nicely and not had to play with the years. But I think it was Sir Robert Anderson who suggested this one. And what he did is he turned the years instead of just going year by year. He said if we calculate 3 years of 360 days, And like, why would you do that? Well, there's some times back in Genesis where it seems to reflect that. I'm not sure if they knew when a year was exactly, or at least how they calculated it. I think they knew, but they were calculating them a little bit differently. And then you turn that back into regular years after you've done that calculation. It compresses that down a bit to bring you from 444 BC to, I think it's either 30 or 33 BC. I haven't done the math lately. But again, the time of the cross. And remember how our dispensationalist friends, they see the church age as a parenthesis. They see that as parenthetical, where you had God dealing with Israel, and he's going to deal with Israel again after the rapture. But in the meantime, you have the church age. And then at the end of the church age, Jesus comes and takes the church out. And so God doesn't deal with them anymore. They're up in heaven. And God begins again dealing with Israel. And that's that 70th week, a 70, that's 7 years of tribulation, great tribulation. And then Jesus comes at the end of that. That's the dispensational plan of looking at this passage. And again, it works as long as you're willing to change the years, but you don't really have to change the years. You could have gone with that previous date, and that still would have worked too. Third view, the historic interpretation. When we remember how we talked about historical premillennialism, but this doesn't have to be premillennialism. It's just a historic interpretation. Uh, Probably would see that first decree of Artaxerxes, 457 BC, and you don't have to change the years. Just keep them as regular years all the way 69 weeks. Remember, you're running those two sections, the 7 weeks and then the 63 weeks. You're running them concurrently, or 62 weeks, I'm sorry, to the beginning of the ministry of Jesus. And then in the middle of the 70th week, the Messiah is cut out. And then after this, not the day after, but after this, Jerusalem is destroyed. Remember, Jerusalem was destroyed in the year 70 AD. So again, this works. You've got three different pictures, three different arrangements of this prophecy that each work after their fashion. Now, we're going to ask, what do we make of that? But let's continue. Let's read first the rest of the chapter. Daniel chapter 26, 9 verse 26. Remember, we said after the 62 weeks, the Messiah will be cut off and have nothing. And the people of the prince who is to come will destroy the city and the sanctuary, and the end will come with a flood. Even to the end, there will be war. Desolations are determined. So the city is destroyed, and the temple is destroyed with it, the city and the sanctuary. Now, that's starting to sound a lot like what Titus did in the year 70 AD. Again, that fits. Verse 27, and he will make a firm covenant with the many for 1 week. But in the middle of the week, he will put a stop to sacrifice and grain offering, and on the wing of abominations will come one who makes desolate. Again, that desolation idea. Notice an abomination that makes desolate. Do you see that? Do you hear that? Abominations will come who make desolate, even until a complete destruction, one that is decreed, is poured out on the one who makes desolate. And so the one who makes desolate, the one who destroys the city, he himself is made desolate. Now, notice in the middle of the week. Well, that works for the Maccabean interpretation, because in the middle of the week, the the he went back on his word. Antiochus went back on his word, and he went into the temple and put up a statue of himself in the temple, and made it all desolate until he was driven out. And then after he was driven out, that wasn't the case anymore, and the temple was cleansed. In fact, our Jewish friends celebrate Hanukkah each year. It took place around December, where the temple was cleansed, and that was a wonderful thing. This works for our dispensational view. Of course, the middle of the week hasn't happened yet. They're saying that's still future. That still is yet to come. So you know you can't prove that it's happened yet because it hasn't happened yet. But they're looking for that to yet be fulfilled in the future. And then for the historic view, notice in the middle of the week, he'll put a stop to sacrifice. That's not that the sacrifices in the temple stopped, but Jesus was crucified, and the reasons for the sacrifices aren't there anymore. So in that sense, that took place. And then subsequent to that, after that, you have Again, abominations rendering the temple desolate. It doesn't happen that week. It doesn't happen that year. But within that generation, Titus comes and destroys the city of Jerusalem, 70 AD. And if you go to Jerusalem today, and I don't mean to be mean when I say this, but if you go to Jerusalem today, you will find standing on the site of the Temple Mount an abomination that renders it desolate to Jewish worship. And let me just add Christian worship as well. I've been on the Temple Mount. I was not there to worship because if Christians started worshiping there, the Muslims would get very upset because there is a Muslim dome there, a Muslim structure. Um, and I'm not saying it's a terrible looking structure or anything like that, no. But because of that structure there, neither Christians nor Jews worship there any longer. So the temple and the enemy. We saw how the Maccabean view sees this as Antiochus IV, who desecrated the temple in 168 BC, and then 3.5 years later, he's driven out, and the temple is liberated, and it's restored, and the feast of Hanukkah celebrates that to this day. The second view has the Roman general Titus, who destroyed the temple in the year AD 70. The temple itself was destroyed. It wasn't just desecrated, it was actually destroyed. And still to this day has not been rebuilt, and there's no temple there. The third view looks to the future, a future Antichrist. We'll talk about this idea of Antichrist in a future class. Future Antichrist who will desecrate the temple, and of course you can't prove that because it hasn't happened yet. But that's the point; it's still future. Now, what shall we say to all three of these? I can't help but think that they might not all be mutually exclusive. That is, Antiochus, I think, is a fulfillment, at least in part, and quite a bit of the parts are fulfilled in him, as well as the Roman general Titus. And I can't say about a future Antichrist because it hasn't happened yet. And remember, we said that prophecy is always easier to interpret after it's been fulfilled. And if that hasn't been fulfilled yet, then we ought to be a bit careful about being too dogmatic. But when we put all of these together, then perhaps what we're meant to see is the Messiah who brings it all together and really that it focuses on him. So yes, it's okay if we look at those other enemies and things like that, but don't, in your looking at those things, don't miss the Messiah, because really the prophecy is all about him.